So it's a literary trope, isn't it? The storm. When a story begins, it was a dark and stormy night. We all know that trouble is coming. The storm has always been used as a symbol of destruction and upheaval. And it's also often been seen, I think I'm going to say always, actually, in all time, some people or other have seen the storm as, a message from God, usually of divine displeasure. And that started way back with Noah's flood, which is presented to us as, the result of human beings behaving badly and God having enough of us. And it continues to this present day. We have been experiencing increasingly extreme weather across the globe this decade. And in 2017, there were exceptional storms in the United States, including the named Irma and Harvey storms. And if you'd been following the press at the time, you would have seen that not just preachers, not just weirdo televangelists, but senators and elected politicians claiming that the storm was God's message. And the message was this: gay marriage was a bad thing. And, I, for one, seriously doubt the power of lesbianism to cause global storms. Might be wrong. But I do think the alt-right might have a point in saying that the storms that we are experiencing are in some way a comment on human behaviour. In particular, probably a sign that all is not that well between us and our relationship with the planet. So both today's stories are stormy. First storm comes when Prophet Elijah is hiding in a cave. He's on the run. There's a price on his head. And the second comes when the disciples are on the boat crossing to the other shore. But in both cases, it's not the storm that causes dismay and fear. It's the stillness that follows the storm. The stillness in which they're aware of God's presence. This is a presence that causes Elijah to ditch his job, alleluia, to give up leading the jihad of the Israelites against their neighbors. And it leads to the disciples getting a right telling off. So we know the story of the disciples in the boat quite well, although we do tend to confuse the two. There's one with Jesus in the boat and one with Jesus out of the boat. Anyway, we assume in both these stories that the disciples are being told off because they're afraid of the storm. Text doesn't tell us that the disciples were afraid of the storm. Disciples were really experienced fishermen, knew the waters well, unlikely to be that fazed by the storm. We're told that they were frightened by the presence of Jesus coming toward them. Elijah, the words are not the same, but he's also getting a bit of a telling off, because here he is in his cave, and God, throughout the text, there's this repeated phrase, and God keeps saying to him, Elijah, what are you doing here? What are you doing, Elijah? And perhaps Jesus's rebuke for their lack of faith is the same question. Essentially, he's also saying to disciples, what are you doing here? I sent you off across a lake hours ago when the sea was still and the winds were calm. And I gave you really clear instructions. Go to the other side. And hours later, in the early hours of the morning, when I left you in early evening, here you are mucking about in the middle of the lake. I sent you to the other side. Other here means Gentile. It means people who are not like us. And the disciples have been following Jesus around. He's been curing and feeding and healing and teaching their people. But now he's asked them to go across to the other people. And I don't think it's an accident that they didn't get there. I don't think they ever wanted to go there in the first place. I don't think they were prevented by the storm, unless the storm is a symbol of their own doubts and conflicts, which is possible. Disciples have never understood Jesus' fascination with the other. And many stories in the Gospels tell us about Jesus taking them into Gentile territory and them generally behaving really badly. Think Brits abroad on the Costa del Sol. They call down fire and vengeance on the Samaritan village. They're, shouting at the Samaritan woman, the story we have next week, saying she shouldn't, she shouldn't be there and she doesn't deserve to even talk to Jesus. So generally, they're not that good at dealing with foreigners. Elijah is terrible at dealing with foreigners. I mean, disciples' rudeness just pales into insignificance because Elijah slaughters them. He is a terrorist. He is a jihadist. He is just slaughtering the hell out of anyone who's not of his race and faith. And yet God really tries with Elijah. God keeps also sending Elijah across barriers to the other side. You'll remember in an earlier story when he's dying, God sends him into enemy territory where the widow of Zarephath, of a different faith, a different race, keeps him alive. And what does he do? He crosses back into his own land and calls down, jihad all over again. And God finally shows him violence when he's at the end of his tether, when his violence is now rebounding on himself. He himself is in danger of death. And God shows him the earthquake, the storm, the wind, the fire, and says, God's not here. God's not in any of this. It's impressive, but these are not where to find God. God is in the stillness. I mean, I've been a bit harsh on Elijah, who, when I was a child, was my absolute favourite prophet, and so dramatic. And on the disciples, because, at least they have got the message that all is not well with the world, that trouble is coming, and they desperately want a better world. And they're full of zeal and passion to bring about a new way of living. The trouble is, they just don't listen. They just keep heading off under their own steam in entirely the wrong direction. They don't get that they can't put things right by just concentrating on their people at the expense of those around them. When storms are raging, it's hard to be still and to listen to the voice of God, because we've got really good form on listening to our own voice instead, or our mates. And we would rather rely on our own considerable ingenuity and energy to bring about the change that we perceive is needed in the world. We are living in stormy times, and I'm sure you have all read the forecasts that it's likely to get worse. Unemployment rates are rising, the economy is faltering. We struggle against a climate emergency and a global pandemic, and that's just the tip of the iceberg, really. We know we're in trouble. But perhaps these storms are not the real trouble. Perhaps they're just a sign, a big old divine hint that we have been heading in entirely the wrong direction. And maybe, just maybe, if we stop and listen to the still small voice of calm, the storms may abate and we may start to see what direction we should be heading in.